David Lee Roth has finally broken his silence on Sammy Hagar's heartfelt tribute to Eddie Van Halen, and let's just say, it's not what fans expected. In an explosive reveal, Roth doesn't hold back, throwing some serious shade at his former bandmate's emotional tribute. What did Roth really think about Sammy's heartfelt gesture? The truth might surprise you, and it's bound to stir up more than just old rock and roll drama. You don't want to miss this. David Lee Roth's career began in the early 1970s, long before he became the legendary frontman of Van Halen. Born in 1954 in Bloomington, Indiana, Roth had a passion for performance from a young age. His interest in music started early, and he was drawn to rock and roll and the energy it embodied. Roth's early influences included artists like Mick Jagger and Jim Morrison, and he quickly learned that being a frontman wasn't just about singing. It was about entertaining, captivating the audience, and commanding the stage. While attending Pasadena City College in California, Roth began to make connections in the music scene. He formed a few local bands, but his big break came when he joined Van Halen in 1974. At the time, Van Halen was just a group of young, talented musicians trying to make it in the competitive Los Angeles music scene. The band was formed by guitarist Eddie Van Halen and drummer Alex Van Halen, and they quickly gained attention for their blistering performances and Eddie's innovative guitar playing. Roth's arrival was the final piece of the puzzle. His bold, larger-than-life personality, charismatic stage presence, and powerful vocal delivery meshed perfectly with the band's sound. Roth's flamboyant style and daring antics brought an element of unpredictability to the band's shows. He was as much a showman as he was a singer, often performing high-energy theatrical displays that kept the crowd on its feet. Their first major break came when they were discovered by Gene Simmons of Kiss. Simmons, impressed by their raw talent, helped them secure a record deal with Warner Brothers, which led to the release of their self-titled debut album in 1978. The album was a massive success, featuring iconic tracks like Runnin' with the Devil and Eruption, the latter showcasing Eddie's groundbreaking guitar skills. Van Halen's combination of hard rock, charisma, and Roth's commanding presence helped them quickly become one of the biggest rock bands of the late 1970s. David Lee Roth's career took off with Van Halen, and he became a central figure in the band's success. His wild personality and unique vocal style set him apart from other rock frontmen, and he was instrumental in shaping the band's image and sound. Roth's knack for blending humor, bravado, and musicianship made him a standout in the world of rock and roll, and his early years with Van Halen are still remembered as some of the most exciting in the history of the genre. The tension between David Lee Roth and Sammy Hagar didn't start overnight. It built gradually over time, rooted in differences of personality, approach, and ultimately control within Van Halen. When Sammy Hagar first joined Van Halen in 1985, following Roth's departure, the band's dynamic changed drastically. Initially, many fans and critics were skeptical about the change in lead singers. Roth had become synonymous with the band's energy, style, and identity. His flamboyant, larger-than-life persona was one of the core reasons for Van Halen's immense success during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Sammy, on the other hand, was known for his more straightforward rock style and was considered a highly skilled but less flashy frontman. The chemistry in Van Halen shifted with Hagar at the helm. Though the band still achieved success, particularly with hits like Why Can't This Be Love and Jump, the underlying tensions were beginning to surface. Hagar's style of leadership was different from Roth's. He was more focused on business and less on the high-energy theatrics Roth had brought to the band. As Van Halen continued to release albums and tour, the divide between Hagar and the Van Halen brothers began to grow. Many of the issues stemmed from Sammy's increasingly toxic behavior, especially behind the scenes. Hagar, who had come from a more independent background, often seemed frustrated with the band's internal politics, particularly with Eddie Van Halen's dominance in the band. Sammy, who prided himself on being a versatile musician and a vocal leader, began to make it clear that he wanted more control over the band's direction. As time went on, Hagar's behavior became more divisive. He was often accused of being self-centered and determined to change the band's identity to suit his own preferences. Hagar's influence, or perceived overreach, made it difficult for the band to function cohesively. His autocratic approach to band decisions began to erode the natural balance within the group. Sammy Hagar's increasingly toxic attitude towards Van Halen's legacy started to create deep rifts. In particular, his tensions with Eddie Van Halen became more pronounced. Hagar, who had already made a name for himself as a successful solo artist before joining Van Halen, wanted to have more creative control. But Eddie, who had always been the driving force behind Van Halen's sound, wasn't willing to relinquish that control. Sammy's attempts to challenge Eddie's authority were often met with resistance, which only fueled the tension between them. This conflict wasn't just about music, it was personal. Sammy's increasingly antagonistic behavior caused a lot of bad blood within the band. Hagar's critiques of Eddie's playing style, especially his attitude towards the band's image, did not sit well with the Van Halen brothers. Hagar, ever the perfectionist, began to question Eddie's approach to the music, accusing him of being unprofessional or too controlling. He even began to hint that Eddie was trying to sabotage the band's success, particularly in the years leading up to their 1995 album, Balance. By the time of Balance's recording and subsequent tour, Sammy's toxicity was impossible to ignore. Sammy's attempts to disrupt the band, in part by focusing more on his solo career and less on Van Halen's collective efforts, made it harder for the group to function as a cohesive unit. Hagar's incessant criticism of Eddie and the band's creative process started to wear on the other members, particularly when it became clear that Sammy was less concerned about the group's harmony and more focused on his own individual success. As a result, the chemistry between Hagar and the band began to unravel. What made this even more troubling was Sammy's refusal to acknowledge or work on the band's core issues. Rather than seeking reconciliation or compromise, Hagar would often go on the offensive, calling out his bandmates in interviews or during live performances. This put the band in an incredibly difficult position, as they were torn between their loyalty to their original guitarist and their need to appease Hagar, who was not only a bandmate but a commercial asset as well. The final straw came in 1996, when the rift between Sammy Hagar and the Van Halen brothers became irreparable. Sammy's relationship with the band was deteriorating rapidly, and during a tour stop, he and Eddie had a heated argument that would essentially mark the end of Hagar's tenure with Van Halen. It was revealed that Sammy had been pushing for more control and creative input in the band, which Eddie viewed as a betrayal of Van Halen's core ethos. By the end of the tour, it was clear that Hagar's time in Van Halen had come to an end. What many fans did not realize at the time was that Hagar's departure was not a simple breakup. It was the result of years of mounting frustration. Sammy's desire for control over the band and his attempts to shape Van Halen into a vehicle for his own ambitions left deep scars, and the Van Halen brothers were done tolerating his toxic behavior. Sammy's tenure with Van Halen, while commercially successful, was marred by the underlying tension and the relentless drive for personal power. When Hagar was fired in 1996, the fallout was massive. Hagar's anger was evident, and it wasn't long before he took to the media, claiming that Eddie's ego and control issues had ruined the band. Sammy accused Eddie of trying to tear the band apart by creating a toxic work environment, a sentiment that was shared by many close to the band. But for Eddie and Alex, it was clear that Sammy's toxic behavior had reached a point where it was no longer possible to make the band work. Though the years have passed since Sammy Hagar's departure, the tension between him and the Van Halen brothers still lingers. The conflicting stories and differing viewpoints about his time in the band have fueled debates among fans. But one thing is clear. Sammy Hagar's time in Van Halen was marked by a toxic rivalry and a battle for control, ultimately leading to his departure from the iconic rock band. David Lee Roth, known for his distinctive personality, humor, and iconic role as the frontman of Van Halen, has never been one to shy away from speaking his mind. Recently, he offered his candid thoughts on Sammy Hagar's new tribute song to Eddie Van Halen, Encore, Thank You Goodnight. The song, which Sammy Hagar co-wrote with guitar virtuoso Joe Satriani, was inspired by a dream Hagar had, where Eddie visited him and helped him pen a final farewell. This track, filled with raw emotion and reverence for Eddie, sparked a range of reactions from the Van Halen fanbase. Some praised it as a heartfelt tribute, while others questioned Hagar's motivations, especially given his often controversial remarks about his time in Van Halen and his relationship with the Van Halen brothers. As someone who has had a long, complex relationship with Hagar, Roth's take on the tribute was met with great interest. In a recent appearance on Rock Weekly Radio, Roth didn't hold back, offering a mix of respect, wit, and his signature Diamond Dave charm. Roth was quick to acknowledge the heartfelt nature of the song, giving Hagar credit for creating something genuine. "Look, I give the guy credit, it's heartfelt," Roth said, recognizing the emotional weight behind Hagar's effort. Roth's response was thoughtful and reflected his personal view on the tribute, which came with no small amount of reverence for Eddie. It was clear that while there were tensions between him and Sammy, Roth was more focused on Eddie's legacy than on personal grievances. However, Roth's personality was on full display when he went on to compliment Joe Satriani's guitar performance, which was a central feature of the song. He said, "Satriani shredded like a beast, like Ed would have smiled and said, 'Okay, now do it backwards.'" This humorous line, typical of Roth's playful and sometimes irreverent style, served to highlight his appreciation for the musical craftsmanship of the song. It also subtly reflected Roth's deep understanding of Eddie Van Halen's unique guitar technique. Eddie, of course, was known for his lightning-fast fingers and the revolutionary use of two-handed tapping. Roth's comparison of Satriani's performance to Eddie's style was his way of saying, "This is a tribute worthy of the man himself." Despite the warm and respectful words from Roth, there remained some underlying tension between him and Hagar, stemming from years of rivalry and differing personalities. For Roth, this rivalry wasn't just about their roles in Van Halen. It was also about their approach to music and their attitudes towards fame. Roth, with his larger-than-life persona, always embraced the chaos and energy of rock and roll, while Hagar's approach to Van Halen was seen by some, including Roth, as more methodical and even businesslike. But in his comments about the tribute song, Roth chose not to focus on these past differences. Instead, he pointed out the sincerity behind the song. "There's always chatter," Roth acknowledged during his radio appearance. "Sammy's always talked, sometimes too much. Hell, so have I." It was a self-aware moment, with Roth recognizing that both he and Hagar had been known to speak their minds on occasion. But instead of dwelling on the sometimes controversial things Hagar had said over the years, Roth chose to emphasize the value of the tribute itself. But when someone sits down, puts pen to paper, and pours some soul into a song, for a guy like Eddie Van Halen, that's not something you trash. That's something you tip your hat to. Roth's ability to recognize the sincerity in Hagar's gesture, despite their strained relationship, showed his maturity in the face of what could have been a contentious issue. Roth also compared the way each of them had processed Eddie's passing. For Roth, his tributes to Eddie came from a place of memory and mischief, as he often had a more playful relationship with the Van Halen legacy. His songs "Somewhere Over the Rainbow Bar and Grill" and "Nothing Could Have Stopped Us Then" were not just about Eddie's music, but also about the spirit of fun and adventure that Eddie embodied. Roth, the showman, embraced the wild side of rock and roll and infused that energy into his own tribute. In contrast, Hagar's tribute was deeply personal, stemming from a dream where Eddie himself helped Hagar pen the farewell song. Roth summed it up with a classic line: "Mine came out of memory and mischief. His came out of a dream. That's the difference between Dave and Sam, right? I'm Broadway chaos. He's Cabo clarity." This comment highlighted the essential differences between the two men. Roth was always about the chaos, the unpredictability, and the larger-than-life spectacle of rock and roll, while Hagar was seen as more introspective, often focused on clarity and a more straightforward approach to life and music. But despite these differences, Roth acknowledged that both of them loved Eddie and were honoring him in their own ways. In his eyes, the differences between him and Hagar were just that, differences. But they were not something that should detract from Eddie's legacy. Roth's ability to recognize that Hagar's tribute was valid, even if it wasn't his own style, was a sign of the respect he had for both Eddie and the process of paying tribute. As the interview continued, Roth's humor remained a central theme. When asked if a reconciliation with Hagar was possible, Roth responded with his signature wit, saying, "Oh, the hatchet's long buried. I just don't remember which desert we left it in." This light-hearted remark, which took a dig at their past tensions, was classic Roth, acknowledging the past while making it clear that he didn't take things too seriously. Roth's response to the possibility of a reconciliation showed that, despite everything that had happened between them over the years, he was focused more on the present and the shared love for Eddie. Roth's humor also came into play when he was asked what Eddie might have thought about Hagar's tribute. With a grin, Roth said, "He'd probably laugh, crank the volume, and say, 'Nice try, Red. Now watch this.' Then, he'd play something nobody's ever heard before and leave us all chasing ghosts again. This playful, almost wistful comment reflected Roth's belief that Eddie would have loved the tribute, but that he would have responded with something even more mind-blowing, something that only Eddie could do. Roth's comment, while humorous, also reflected his deep admiration for Eddie's musical genius and his belief that Eddie's legacy would continue to inspire long after his death. With both Roth and Hagar having now released their own tributes to Eddie, it became clear that the bond they shared with him and the legacy he left behind was greater than the differences they had as individuals. For Roth, Eddie wasn't just a bandmate, he was a source of inspiration, a partner in creating music that would go down in history as some of the most electrifying rock and roll ever created. And despite the tension and rivalry between Roth and Hagar, it was Eddie's memory that united them. Through their tributes, both Roth and Hagar showed that regardless of their personal differences, they were united in honoring the man who changed the face of rock guitar forever. David Lee Roth, the charismatic frontman of Van Halen, has always been known for his sharp wit, biting humor, and ability to keep the world guessing. So when asked about the possibility of a reconciliation with Sammy Hagar, his former bandmate in Van Halen, Roth didn't disappoint. The history between the two is long, complicated, and often filled with moments of tension. But, as with most things in Roth's world, he isn't afraid to confront the awkwardness with humor and a touch of self-awareness. During an appearance on Rock Weekly Radio, Roth was asked about the chances of him and Sammy Hagar ever burying the hatchet. For most people, this would be a difficult or even uncomfortable question to answer. After all, the two rock stars had a famously tumultuous relationship, full of public spats, personal differences, and competing egos. But not for Roth. Instead of getting defensive or dismissive, Roth embraced the opportunity to poke fun at their past, while acknowledging the ongoing tension between him and Hagar. "Oh, the hatchet's long buried," Roth quipped, a playful smile undoubtedly crossing his face. "I just don't remember which desert we left it in." This comment, delivered with Roth's signature comedic timing, encapsulated the essence of his take on the idea of reconciliation with Sammy. Roth's humor here does several things at once. First, it acknowledges that there was conflict, serious conflict, between him and Hagar. The hatchet metaphor implies that there were issues that needed to be resolved, but the fact that he doesn't remember exactly where the hatchet was buried adds a sense of irreverence. It's as if Roth is saying, "Yes, we had our issues, but I've moved on. It's in the past and we're not going to dwell on it." Roth's ability to turn what could have been an uncomfortable subject into a moment of humor shows just how much he uses comedy as a coping mechanism for the complexities in his life. However, this comment also reveals something deeper. Roth is no stranger to the tension that still lingers between him and Hagar. He's aware of the history, and he knows that fans and the media alike continue to dissect their relationship. But Roth's approach is to make light of it, to not take things too seriously, and to show that, despite everything, he's not losing sleep over it. The line about the desert is pure Roth, playful, irreverent, and a little cheeky. It allows him to deflect the question without completely ignoring it. After all, the world knows that there was a lot of drama between Roth and Hagar during their Van Halen years, but Roth's humor shows that he's not dwelling on those old wounds. But, as always with Roth, there's more than just the surface-level humor. Underneath the quip about the hatchet is a deeper acknowledgement of the relationship between him and Hagar, one that is more complicated than either side is willing to fully admit. Roth's comment, by making light of the past, also hints at the fact that, deep down, he has moved on from the drama that once seemed to define their interactions. It's a subtle way of saying, yes, there were moments of conflict, but that's not what defines us anymore. Roth doesn't need to rehash the details of past spats. Instead, he uses humor to convey that they've both changed, and perhaps the days of animosity are behind them. Still, even though Roth's humorous response downplays the tension, it also subtly acknowledges the reality that reconciliation, while possible, is probably not imminent. In the same breath, Roth makes it clear that while the hatchets may be buried, he's not about to go out of his way to resurrect the relationship with Hagar. He's fine with where things are. He's not interested in revisiting old battles. But that doesn't necessarily mean he's ready to embrace Hagar with open arms. Roth's way of addressing the possibility of reconciliation shows that he's not going to spend his time dwelling on something that's long since passed. For many, this response from Roth will be seen as typical, classic Diamond Dave, as people like to say. But what makes his answer particularly interesting is the nuance behind it. It's not just about deflecting the question or making light of the situation. Roth's playful tone comes with an undercurrent of maturity. He's acknowledging that their past conflicts don't have to define their present or future. The history is what it is, and while fans may long for some sort of reunion or resolution, Roth doesn't seem to feel the need to rush into any kind of emotional confrontation with Hagar. One of the reasons Roth can make this joke about the Hatchets is because of his undeniable confidence. He knows who he is and is unapologetic about it. Roth has always been larger than life, and he's not about to let the past dictate his present or future. His lighthearted approach to the reconciliation question also shows that he's not looking for validation from anyone, least of all Sammy Hagar. In fact, Roth's response is almost a challenge to anyone who might think there's unresolved business between him and his former bandmate. "I've moved on, so should you," seems to be the message.